Hello, everyone. I'm David Leavitt, and I'm here with John Swallow.
Hi, everybody.
And we're doing our best to look decent broadcasting. I'm trying to figure out, the sun's just going down in Orem, Utah, and so it's starting to blind my eyes. So while people are still logging in, I'm going to stand up and see if I can close a blind or something. Give me 1 second.
Great, and I'll filibuster a little bit while David's getting that taken care of. We sure appreciate everybody joining in, and it's kind of the end of an exciting time over the next 3 days, and we wanted to give you all of you, a chance to kind of get to see us side by side. We invited the other candidate in the race. They say it's a jinx to kind of mention names of people who aren't there, so I won't. But he declined, and so he had his own deal at 5:30, and as I understand it, he didn't take a single question. He just talked to people. That's fine, but we're going to take questions. What we're going to do, David, if I can just introduce this.
Yeah, please go ahead.
We're going to both open for a minute, because I've always thought as I've had these, that it's good for you to kind of get a feel for who we are, a little bit about our background and families and things. And then what we like to just turn it over to you for questions. And we just probably go, if it's David's turn to answer the question first, he'd answer it, and then I'd add anything that I had to add to that. And if I went first, he'd then have a chance to answer anything else he'd like to on the question. And we thought we'd just go back and forth for the hour. And we just want you both to know, all to know, that we really, both of us, appreciate your time and your interest. And we hope that you're looking at our campaign speeches too. I know that David put a lot of work into his, and I put some work into mine too. And we hope you look at those and get a feel for who we are, what we stand for. So David, I think we flipped a coin, and I won, so you get to go first. If you want to go first and introduce yourself to everybody.
No problem. Our format here is, I'll take 5 to 6 or 7 minutes to tell you a little about me and why I'm running. John's going to do the same. There is no moderator. If I start to talk too long, John will give me a shepherd hook, and if he does the same, I'll do the same to him. And then when we ask, I think what we're going to do, depending on how many questions there are, if you have questions, I think the only fair way to go about this is to get your questions in early, because we'll just take the first come, first serve questions. That's probably the best way to do it. One of us will take a crack at answering it, and then the other one will follow up, and then we'll reverse. And so I think that's what we agreed upon, isn't it? That's
great. And you know what? If this is fun enough and good enough, maybe, I haven't talked to David about this. I hate to surprise people in public, but maybe we can do this again, because we have a couple of days. So I don't know what your plans are, David, but
I have tried to be as open and transparent as possible.
Good.
So having said that, John, you time how long I take, and then you take the same amount of time. How's that?
And David, just talk for a few minutes and get comfortable, and don't worry about the time. We'll be okay.
I went to law school in 1988, and my intent, frankly, was to join the family business. I had a class in my second year of law school that completely turned me around. The class was on the criminal justice system, on advocacy, on the jury trial, and this whole process that deals with our freedoms. I had the difficult conversation of going back to the family and my dad and saying, Dad, I'm not going to join the family business. Shalom, who's my wife and was my law partner for 20 some odd years, we went to law school together. We moved to a small town in central Utah and hung a shingle, and I became a public defender, and she did general law practice. I began really an odyssey for me, a process whereby I began to learn about the criminal justice system, and I started to learn about it as a small town public defender. I learned in my first case, the first case in which into which I was appointed, about dealing with the mentally ill. I had a client with 5 personalities and a very difficult problem. And I learned that the criminal justice system can be a very difficult place for the mentally ill. As I went through the practice after about 4 years of being a small town public defender, I was given the opportunity. I was appointed by the Juab County Commission to be the Juab County Attorney. I was the youngest county attorney in the state at the time at 31 years old. And quite frankly, I was probably far too young to be the elected county attorney because, you know, an elected county attorney has a tremendous amount of authority and a tremendous amount of responsibility. And it really was quite an interesting proving ground for me and taught me an awful lot. I served as a Juab County attorney for 8 years. And in a small town, you prosecute, you know, in fact, you learn to do very difficult things. I prosecuted in Juab County 6 people whose homes were contiguous to mine at the time I prosecuted them. I prosecuted a woman in my church congregation. Those of you who are familiar with the Latter-day Saint culture understand the concept of home teaching. I prosecuted a woman I was home teaching at the time I was home teaching her. Those are the sorts of things, because in a small town, you don't have the benefit of lots and lots of lawyers.
God wasn't happy with that statement, David. Something happened. I think we got a frozen screen for David, or a bad connection. I've got a message coming in. Well, that's a question. David, for some reason on my screen, nothing's happening. You have a frozen image. What I don't know is if everyone else can hear you fine. And so I don't want to interrupt you. So while I'm waiting for my campaign to let me know if there's a problem, David, are you back?
What was the last thing what was the last thing I said?
You were talking about prosecuting the primary president.
Oh, that's right. I didn't say that's who it was. I said it was a woman in my congregation.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I learned that as a small town prosecutor, you know, you have to find and weigh justice in a very specific way. And in my bid for a third term, I lost the election by 22 votes. And I learned that, you know, a small town prosecutor, as they should, probably has a shelf life, because you're prosecuting people and you affect their lives in a very serious way. As a small town prosecutor, I had one part-time deputy for most of my tenure there. As a small town prosecutor, you handle it all. You handle every criminal case, every civil case, and so you get this broad sense of how things work. After that, I went to back to defending, and I became a federal public defender, defending some of the most serious crimes in the federal courts. And I remember being in a 10-foot jail cell, a 10-foot by 10-foot jail cell, when my client had just been given a life sentence after a 3-week, very taxing jury trial. And as his shrieks of anger at you know, whatever, morphed into sobs of despair because he realized that he would never get out of prison, I just kind of broke. I snapped. I realized, you know what, I've been doing this for now 15 years almost, and it's just too long, and I am jaded, and I'm burned out. I have all the capacity in the world and the skill in the world, but I don't have the heart to give it to my clients at this point. And so my Shalom and I then had 6 children. We now have 8, and we accepted a position with the American Bar Association to go to Ukraine to help the Ukrainian judiciary reform its criminal justice system. In Ukraine, we got to Ukraine literally 10 days before the Orange Revolution of 2004. And the Orange Revolution of 2004, I'd like you to Google it. we don't have time to talk about it right now, but nevertheless, it was a situation where one opposition candidate stood up against the communists, was poisoned, nearly died, and then inspired 45 million Ukrainians to overturn a fabricated election. And I sat there in this square full of literally 1.5 million people, and I learned for the first time about American freedom as I saw what men and women of all ages were willing to do in exchange for what I have always had. And that inspired me to try to help them. And we began trying to teach them about the jury trial and about advocacy. And by the time Shalom and I were done, we were teaching hundreds of law students every year in 38 universities. A 2-semester course would recruit judges and lawyers from the United States to go teach these courses for us. And we were teaching in 38 universities in Ukraine, Moldova, Poland, and Romania. And it gave me this very serious perspective on our legal system. Because let me tell you some disturbing things. The Ukrainians, they have 2 provisions in their constitution that are much like ours. They have the presumption of innocence, and it would be tempting. In fact, I fell for the temptation. It would be tempting at first to believe that they got that from our Constitution, but they didn't. They inherited it from the Soviet Constitution. Nearly the same presumption of innocence, different language, but gives the same right. And you realize, the Soviets didn't care about the presumption of innocence, and you realize that a constitutional protection on paper is meaningless unless the government will give weight to it. The second thing that shocked me was that Ukraine's constitution has a very similar right to a jury trial, like ours. Every Ukrainian citizen has a right to a jury trial, but the fact of the matter is, not once in the history of the country has there ever been a jury trial in Ukraine, not one. And the reason for that is because the citizenry doesn't understand its obligation to a jury trial, and the people in the system have no idea how to do one. Well, I came back to Utah several years ago. I was flying back and forth to Ukraine, and I looked at our own criminal justice system, and I had this epiphany that, who am I to think that I should go fix somebody else's criminal justice system when my own is in such shambles? And I had a pretty good life before I ran for county attorney. I've got a good life now, but I ran for Utah County Attorney on the unapologetic platform of reforming our criminal justice system. And I'll get into that more as the hour goes on. But when I became the county attorney in Utah County, and I upheld my hand and I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, it hit me like a ton of bricks that in our system now, for reasons that you've heard me say in town halls and if you've been to them, it hit me like a ton of bricks that in a system in America now, one prosecutor, the elected prosecutor in every jurisdiction, has the power to investigate anyone he wants to investigate, charge anyone he wants to charge, give a plea bargain to anyone he wants to give a plea bargain to, and he has 100% complete immunity. And I'm sitting here swearing an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, which includes the 6th Amendment right to a trial by jury, and I realize, we're not doing that. 99 times out of 100, we give a plea bargain, and that's a problem. And I'll end with this, that John Adams said that representative government and the trial by jury are the heart and lungs of our liberty. And without them, there's nothing to give us fortification against being ridden like horses, driven like cattle, and fed and clothed like swine and hounds. And that's where we are, ladies and gentlemen. Our liberties are in serious jeopardy. And I'm running for Utah Attorney General, not because I need the office of Attorney General. I'm running for Attorney General because we need to return our system to a balance that will preserve our liberties. John, back to you.
Thanks, David. And that's very inspiring. And I like David Leavitt. I think he's a good man, and I think you can feel his heart and his beliefs and his passion through his statements. Just a little background on me and my family. 35 years ago, I became the luckiest man in the world and met and married my wife, Suzanne. After we finished our studies at BYU, and I went to law school and finished at BYU, we moved our family to Sandy, where we live in the same cul-de-sac for 30 years now. They still call us friends, and we love our neighbors very, very much. They've been with us through the good times and through the tough times. After law school, I was hired by a law firm in downtown Salt Lake, and after 5 years became a partner in the firm, an owner of the firm. And then I chased my first real dream besides law school, and that was I ran for the state legislature. And for 6 glorious years, I had the opportunity to learn the intersection between constitutional philosophy and the practicality of enacting legislation that my neighbors entrusted me to sponsor and vote on for them through our constitutional republic system. It meant the world to me, and I fought hard on the conservative issues of our time. I sponsored the largest tax cut in the history of our state, was named the Taxpayer Advocate of the Year for the state of Utah because I wanted to return and did return $110 million to taxpayers in Utah, because I understand that it's your money that you earn, and the government shouldn't have a dime more than they absolutely need for the essential services of government under our system. I sponsored and passed a major property rights piece of legislation because I believe fundamentally that property is one of those rights that we enjoy, a God-given right to own property. I led the charge in choice for education for our parents by sponsoring the tuition tax credit legislation and giving school choice to parents and families, and also was involved in the charter school legislation. And then I also fought hard to defend our God-given right to defend ourselves that is protected by our Second Amendment, and was recognized for sponsoring and passing legislation to protect our right to keep and bear arms, and the NRA recognized me with an A+ rating. So I was a civil litigator. I wasn't in prosecution, and I wasn't in the justice system at all. I left the legislature to run for Congress, and I twice was nominated by our party to carry the banner against Jim Matheson. The first time I lost by 1/2 a point. It was so close, and by a plurality. In other words, another third-party candidate took 3 or 4% of the vote, and so I lost 48.5% to 48%, or I would have been in Congress and defeated the Matheson family. But I was very great experience to run for that high office, to represent us in Washington as a conservative, someone who understands states' rights. In 2009, I was asked by the Attorney General to leave my practice, where I was general counsel for a company, and join the Attorney General's office as the Chief Deputy Attorney General over the civil side of the office. And David will tell you that there's a civil and a criminal side to the responsibilities of an elected city, county, or certainly a state attorney general. And so in that position, I was able to not only represent all of the 7 divisions in the AG's office, all the agencies of the state, but I was also assigned a few constitutional responsibilities that really, really taught me what it is to be an attorney general. I was asked to lead the fight against the unconstitutional Obamacare, which resulted in me working with 23 other states and going with that case all the way to the Supreme Court. And let me tell you why it was important. Congress only has limited powers that are enumerated to it under the Constitution. And one of those is the Commerce Clause power, where most of the legislation that impacts individuals in the states are passed under Commerce Clause authority. It's intentionally limited to that. But with Obamacare, Congress tried to pass a law that said that a man and a woman sitting on a couch in their living room deciding not to buy something constituted getting into the stream of commerce and authorized legislation under the Commerce Clause, and we disagreed. And so 24 states got together, hired good counsel, and took it all the way to the Supreme Court, where I sat on the front row for 3 days of hearings, helping our side preserve the Commerce Clause protections for states' rights. And we won. Even though we lost the case, the Supreme Court decided that, unlike what Obama said, the Congress passed it under the taxing power not the Commerce Clause power. And we got some real guardrails established in that case. And it taught me two important things about what we can do from our offices as attorneys general. Number one, that even when we lose, we can win if we're standing up for constitutional liberties. And number two, that sometimes Utah needs to stand alone, but a lot of times we cannot have to stand alone if we will work with other like-minded states. So for example, on the public lands issue that I was very involved in, we were able to work with, my goal was to work with all the Western states in the organization called the Conference of Western Attorneys General, which I was a member of, and unite our influence and resources to stand up for important Western issues like the public lands issue. As many of you know, in 2012, I was elected overwhelmingly in the primary. I think it was like 68% to 32% over Sean Reyes. The people of Utah knew my vision, knew my feelings about the Constitution, and knew what I would do, and they elected me overwhelmingly over Mr. Reyes. Then I won the general election by a 2/3 majority as well. 5 days after I got into office, the attacks started, and I was viciously and ruthlessly attacked in a way I would only describe as similar to what our president has gone through in Washington. Since the day he was elected, he has been subject to targeted attacks by his political enemies. After a period of time, it got so overwhelming for the state, for my office, that I decided I needed to step aside and do the right thing and as a private citizen defend my honor. And I was able to clear myself over a period of time. And it wasn't until last October that I received a reimbursement by the state of Utah for all of my damages for what they had done wrongly to me. And so as I got ready to move into the next phase of my life, I'm a partner in a law firm. I'm having a lot of fun, like David was having a lot of fun over in the Ukraine. I saw what was happening with President Trump, and something inside of me just reignited. And I thought, there is no reason why I couldn't go back and finish the job I started and stand up and defend the constitutional liberties of all people in Utah. And so with that, as I struggled with that decision, my family struggled with that decision, I finally got to the point where I couldn't not decide to get into this race and re-engage on the issues. And the big reason, honestly, was not only how I felt about things, but because I had watched for 6 years while this person who was appointed to replace me was in my view, dropping the ball on many issues that were important to our liberties and freedoms, and also hadn't done anything to reform the justice system that I experienced firsthand on the other side, where I learned what really can happen to a person if the government is not subject to what I call checks and balances and accountability, which has become the theme of my campaign. And so I have a plan, and I'll just take another 30 seconds to talk about it. I've got a plan on my website that it's a 5-point plan, and two of the important elements of that are, number one, prosecution reform. And I talk about prosecution reform from a principled standpoint, and we maybe can talk about it today. And then also something that many people haven't thought of, but that's agency checks and balances. So that if you're dealing with an agency, and someone actually called me today and said they had a horrendous problem, a former representative named LeVar Christensen, he called me on the phone and he said, John, DCFS is out of control in Utah. And there are these laws that require for federal funding that they take children away from their parents and permanently terminate their rights when it doesn't have to happen, except that there are these crazy rules. And the AG's office enforces those in favor of the money instead of in favor of the family. So I have an idea that I think is good, that in my administration, I'm going to have a couple of investigators that are going to investigate complaints of abuses of agency power over its citizens and businesses. And with that, I just wanted to compliment David for running and let him know and let you know publicly that I think the world of this man. And if I'm elected Attorney General, I will work with him, and I've invited him to work with me on great ideas of reform. And I believe, and he's told me this, that he would work with me if he is elected and I'm not. So with that, I think we can just open it up to questions. David, if you're ready for questions, and just answer what's on your mind. And we appreciate your time and service and are looking forward to being very responsible and available to you as we go through this process.
Thank you, John. We have kind of competing questions going on. We have the chat line and we have the question and answer line, the question and answer. And I think what we'll do is we'll start with the question and answer. As I've gone through them, there's some overlap, but we will start with Liz's question. Does resolving RS 2477 issues remain a priority? Let me say this, and for those of you who who aren't familiar with RS 2477, RS 2477 is the name of a federal law that says this, that if there's a road that's in existence 10 years prior to the forest being created or the BLM being created or a wilderness area being created, 10 years prior to the creation of a federal land area, then that road is a county road, not owned by the government, but owned by the county. And for years, there's been a fight between counties and the state of Utah on one side and the federal government on the other side. And in various administrations of the Attorney General and frankly the governor, we've had various, different levels of interest or in protecting those roads. Well, when I was the Juab County attorney for 8 years, I spent tremendous amounts of time defending Juab County RS 2477 roads. And we did it aggressively because the federal government with impunity would go and close roads and plow them over and just do really, horrible acts against county road access. It was during the Clinton administration, and their theory was it doesn't really matter who owns the land if no one has access to the land. And so we took the opposite position, and we said, listen, there were some who would say, well, we need to ask the federal government if we can grade this road. And I would say, well, why would we ask the federal government if we can grade our road? It's our road. And so let's go grade our road and assert the ownership that we claim that we have. And so we maintained county roads, RS 2477 roads throughout Juab County. And we would tell the federal government very politely, if you think that this isn't our road, then you go get a court order to stop us from grading it, or charge us with trespassing or something. Let's bring this to a head. They never did. And so the standoff just continued for 8 years. We maintained our roads and we maintained our access. To me, RS 2477 and PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, are the two largest public lands issues that we deal with, because the issue of transferring lands from the federal government to the state is a far more complex issue that has existed for centuries, literally, or more than a century. The most salient question is, do we have access to public lands? Because if we have access to public lands, then it doesn't much matter what a bureaucrat in Washington thinks as we access a public land on a county road on our ATV or in our four-wheel drive or in whatever. And so I believe that the Sean Reyes administration in the Attorney General's office has completely dropped the ball as it deals with RS 2477 road issues. To me, it's a huge priority because Utahns in Utah should have more to say about what goes on in Utah than some bureaucrat on the Eastern Seaboard. And that's the way I feel about it. I am an aggressive lawyer that takes an aggressive stance, and it's the same stance that I took in Juab County is the same stance I'll take for the state of Utah. And let's go grade our roads, make them demonstrate to us that they're not ours. And so, yes, to me, it's a huge priority. Back to you, John.
Thanks, David. I'll take a minute on this as well. Public lands is such an issue that it's on my 5-part plan. Part number 3 is a plan for lands, it's called. Go to my website, look at my plan. I encourage you to do that. Public lands is really near and dear to me. Before the great and respected and revered Bert Smith died of Smith and Edwards, he formed the National Federal Lands Conference, and I was his personal lawyer. When I was chief deputy, I was given an assignment on the civil side of the office, like I said, and I actually lobbied the legislature and provided a doubling of the size of our public lands litigation team, because I believe, like David, that we have to fight for our access rights for hunting and fishing, for recreation with our families, but also for the development of natural resources. One of the byproducts of not recognizing historical roads under RS 2477 is that in the deeper areas of the state, up in the mountains, if we don't have historic roads, then they become candidates for what's called wilderness area, which can completely shut down access and use and development of natural resources, even through leases with the federal government. But I want to take the question beyond that too in a brief just moment. I am committed to also and this is a constitutional principle for me, I do not believe that the founding fathers ever intended for land within the boundaries of a state, a sovereign state, would be owned in large measure by the federal government. And what happened was when we became a state, they duped us. Historically, as the Western expansion happened, what would happen is territories would give land to the federal government on a promise that it would be returned to the states as soon as the Congress approved statehood. And that was done through an establishment clause a contract. It's called the Enabling Act for the state of Utah when it became a state. What happened is right after we became a state, the federal policy changed. 50 years of policy of expansion west changed so that the federal government stopped giving the land back as they promised to do. And for some reason, the state back in the 1920s didn't sue to reclaim those lands. And so it becomes very difficult, like David said, to get that done because there are barriers like the statute of limitations. But just after I left office, the legislature, through the work that I'd done with representatives like Ken Sumption and Chris Herod and Ken Ivory, you probably heard their names if you're interested in land issues, we had worked together to get the energy going, and the legislature, after I left, appropriated $14 million for a lawsuit. And I've always believed, like I learned on the Obamacare fight, that you can file a lawsuit even if you may not win to have a very important purpose. And we learned that in Obamacare and getting the states together. And I would have filed that lawsuit, kept the energy going, and then worked in a combination of the legal side and a political solution to make progress in getting our lands back, because these are our lands. They were given to us by promise by the government. And so I don't think it's a pipe dream, and I don't think it's a waste of money to stand up for our liberties and our constitutional rights. And so as Attorney General, I would reinvigorate the fight on public lands because our children depend upon it. The resources we get from mining and managing and harvesting and leasing public lands as a state would do a lot to fund education in a state that's got big families and a lot of education needs. So I don't want to go into it any deeper, but I want David to know and you to know that I echo his concern about the fight for these lands and these access issues that are important to recreation and development and resources for our kids. And I will re-energize the base and the legislature on that. And I'm going to tell you, this Attorney General we have talked a big talk. He talks a big talk about opioids, and he was represented by the legislature. He talked a big talk when he ran against me before about public lands, and we've seen poof, nothing happen in 6 years. And I think it's time for a change.
Thank you. Okay, John, you're going to get this question first, and I think it's probably better situated for you anyway. Is Sean Reyes really the main person behind the smear campaign and previous allegations against John Swallow?
Great. So all I can say is this: I wasn't in his camp to be a personal eyewitness to his involvement, but there is a private investigator named Robert Joseph who came to me in 2015, who I used to know. He used to be in my neighborhood, and I was actually his ecclesiastical leader, who came to me in 2015 after all this happened and I'd left and I was clearing my name. And he sent an email to a neighbor of mine, and he told a very interesting story to my neighbor. And my neighbor gave me the email, and it said, John Swallow thinks he was a victim of an assassination scheme. He's right. I was involved. I was the tip of the spear. And so I asked him to tell the story in an affidavit, which he signed in August of 2015. And I used it in defense of one of the proceedings against me that I won. But then I went through clearing my name in the trial, and then had other things I needed to work on. But I always had that. And I always thought, you know, it's shameful that someone would lose a primary election and then be so ambitious as to say, I don't care what the people, 650,000 people voted for me to be their Attorney General. I had a vision that was going to change our office and really stand up for our rights and liberties. I had a vision for what it was all about. And then through ambition, they put together an orchestration that we've seen like happen in Washington, D.C. And it's kind of hard to believe that it could happen. I mean, Utah didn't see it coming, and I think that's why it worked so well. But on my website, I have third-party independent evidence of three things that I think are very important to this question. Number one, there's a 46-minute video. And I'm going to tell you, we cut it down to 30 seconds and 2 minutes because people don't have time. But I encourage you to get out a bowl of popcorn and watch the 46-minute unedited video about this investigator telling the story about what happened. Because if you watch that, it will change your perspective of everything. And if you care about what happened to a constitutional officer, you need to watch that. The second thing I have is documented evidence, an admission from a person who worked with a cabinet member of our governor. I don't think our governor knew about it, to destroy me. And she happened to be a supporter actively of Sean Reyes. And the third thing that's on my website is this. It's a radio recorded transcript of an interview with a prosecutor who was one of my prosecutors, who later became convinced that I was innocent. His name is Troy Rawlings, a 14-year county attorney that David Leavitt knows and has worked with. If you read that transcript, you'll learn that he's investigated and found that the Department of Justice sent an operative, the number 4 guy in the Holder administration, to come to Utah and lead the House investigation into me, to cover up for Senator Harry Reid in a bribe that Troy Rawlings says he can prove he took, that skewed the investigation. They were looking for a boogeyman to protect Harry Reid. And so that's why the House concluded that I had done some things that were wrong. But the interesting thing was, at my trial, there was no evidence presented of anything that I'd done that was wrong. And we were just blown away that there was just no evidence. I wasn't, but the reporters were, and they thought there was this huge buildup, and then poof, it was gone. And after that trial, the state bar came in and looked at the House report and everything, all the evidence. And they wrote me a letter that's on my website under the exoneration tab. And it says, John, we looked at everything, all the reports, all the evidence, and we've concluded that you didn't violate any of your ethical standards as a lawyer, which is integrity, honesty, all those things. So not only was I acquitted, and David probably is hearing this for the first time, I was exonerated by the bar. I was paid $1.5 million by the state to reimburse my fees. And at the end of the day, when I hear people like the Democrat that we'll be running against, or Mr. Reyes saying, oh, a constitutional acquittal is not the same thing as evidence, I kind of say, well, maybe there are times when that can happen, but in my situation where the bar came in, where the state came in, where there was just no evidence, where there's evidence of orchestration, you can believe that this happens in America. And I'm here to say, I'm going to come back and I'm going to address the corruption that allowed that to happen so it doesn't happen to you. I'm not worried about it happening to me because I've stood up to the state and won. But with that backbone and fire that I have, I'm going to protect your rights so it never happens to anyone else again in the state. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that my experience plays into your decision on who you might support for Attorney General. David, I'll turn it over to you to debate me or contradict me or whatever you want.
Well, I just want to say that I have defended nearly 1,000 people over the course of my career when I was defending, and it is there's nothing quite like having the unfettered power of government come against you. And John, I've experienced that as a criminal defense attorney, which is completely different than experiencing it as a defendant. I'm grateful that you came through it. I'm grateful that you that you have lived to sing another day, so to speak. Because truly, I can't tell you how many times in my career people say, I had no idea that the criminal justice system had these problems. It's not until it's your son or your daughter or your neighbor or your friend or your someone that you begin to realize that there are real serious problems. And I will tell you that the most serious problem isn't nefarious prosecutors. There are nefarious prosecutors here and there, but by and large, people are people that just want to do what's right. The most dangerous thing are people who are convinced that they're right. And your pride comes into it, and your political motivation comes into it, and then everything goes south. Because we live in a society where you have a prosecutor that literally has almost unfettered power. In Utah County, I have that power. 670,000 approximate people in Utah County, and I have full authority to investigate and charge and plea or not plea. And it's a power, having served as Juab County attorney with 11,000 people, where I learned my, and learned my duty in Juab County, and I understood that the holder of that power has a sacred and solemn duty to exercise it without self-interest, to exercise it in a way that is in the best interest of public safety, to exercise it in a way that absorbs any kind of hit that you take. And so what that means is, you wake up every morning and someone's going to hit you on the left side of the head with a 2x4, or someone's going to hit you on the right side of the head with a 2x4, and your duty is not to retaliate. Your duty is to look at what's best for society, because that's what an elected public servant should be about. Because when you combine that raw power with political motivation and you connect those two, then suddenly you have a possibility where, if you're going to give a plea bargain, you start to think, well, how will this affect me politically? And you either get more tough or more lenient or more something or less something. It affects your charging decisions. And once you start to do that as an elected prosecutor, you have crossed the line, and you begin to build your own political fiefdom or your own political kingdom or your own political whatever on the backs of the people you either investigate or don't investigate. Which brings me to one of my big problems with Sean Reyes, frankly. I mean, I've stayed out of this for the most part because I'm about criminal justice reform, but this is part and parcel of criminal justice reform. And that is this: the Attorney General should be a public servant. The Attorney General should be the person who's willing to take a 2x4 on one side of the head on a Monday and a 2x4 on the other side of the head on a Tuesday, absorb that, and look at what's best for his constituents, for the citizens under, for the citizens that are within his stewardship. Instead, Sean Reyes has utilized the office and the power that comes with Attorney General to give him the opportunity to have FaceTime and access with the rich and the famous of America. And so there becomes this kind of convenient marriage between the rich and famous and the powerful for access to each other. And the rich and the famous give the Attorney General campaign money. The Attorney General spends that campaign money however he wishes. And so it allows the Attorney General to augment his lifestyle. It allows the rich and famous to take a pass and to have access so that things that should be investigated aren't investigated, or possibly that things that shouldn't be investigated are investigated. And we see this very clearly with Sean. And I'm not, Sean's a nice guy. He's a guy that everyone would love to have dinner with, that tries to be very popular, that tries to be outgoing. But this isn't a high school popularity. This isn't a high school student body election. This is who are we going to give the most significant power in the state? To whom are we going to give that? And just consider, on January 27th or 28th, right in the middle of the Sundance Film Festival, Sean Reyes pays $60,000 to one of the poshest hotels in Park City for an event that he bills as Law Day event. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Law Day isn't until next week or whenever May 1st is. And so, and he spends it on out of his campaign fund. And over the last 3 years, he's spent nearly over $1 million actually of his own campaign money, jetting around the country, putting on high-priced events, and it all works because you gotta spend money to make money, right? Well, what he's spending is the currency and the duty of the Attorney General's office, and no one's going to stand up and no one's going to say, well, you were politically motivated. and because of your political motivation, you're going to do things that are contrary to the benefit of the American or the citizens of Utah. You have to look at, you have to look between the lines. You have to look what's going on. You look at and you look at his expenditures, and you see where he's getting his money. You see how it's going out. This isn't about solving Utah's problems. This is about keeping Sean Reyes in a position where he can continue to hobnob with the rich and the famous. And to me, that's a big reason why we need a change in the Attorney General's office.
Thank you, David. Can I jump in? I'm going to make a suggestion that we didn't plan on, but David, do you have anything else that you need to do in the next 45 minutes or half an hour if we went a little longer? We have almost 300 people on the line with us, and I want to hear from you, and I want to talk about some things, and I want you to know that David and I can be available, and those of you who want to drop off at 1 hour are welcome to drop off. But I would like to see if we can keep this channel open for a while, because we're talking about some good things here. And David, with your permission, I'd like to go back, since you talked a little bit about your reform, some of your reform concerns with prosecution, and I just answered the question about what happened to me. Do you mind if I go back and take a few minutes and talk a little bit about reform? And then I'd like to also talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, okay?
Absolutely.
And then let's just have a little more time and not worry about the clock quite so much. And again, you can vote with your feet, people, and you can leave anytime you want, but this is going to get exciting. Okay, yeah, on my plan on my website, and I wrote it myself, and I admit that it doesn't have the input of good people like David and others to augment it. I have a 4-part plan for prosecution reform, and my plan deals with corruption and education. The first part of my plan for prosecution reform, which is a narrower thing than criminal justice reform, because the prosecution part is one element of criminal justice, right? Is number 1, checks and balances and accountability for prosecutors. And it dovetails what David is talking about. It's the same principle, and that is this. When you give a prosecutor unqualified immunity, that means they can do anything they want. They can investigate you, arrest you, and take you all the way to trial, and even do it for a political reason. And there's no consequence because it's within the prosecution office. That's what we've done to protect these prosecutors. A few months ago, a couple of line prosecutors at the Department of Justice were looked at by the United States Attorney General, okay? He was concerned that they had given a recommendation that was wrong on a sentencing guideline. So he wanted to investigate that, look over their shoulder. And the press said 2,000 former DOJ employees immediately cried in outrage and said, you should resign, Attorney General, for having the audacity to look over the shoulder of a line prosecutor. And that's the culture in America of protecting the lack of check and balances of a prosecutor that I want to fix. And I believe David is interested in as well, but I don't want to speak for you, David. So the first thing is I want to make sure that every prosecutor in the state, through the county attorney, looking at his people, and the Attorney General using the role of a supervisor under statutory authority to look over the shoulder of even the county attorney and have the option through complaint process or random audits or a commission or something to hold the decisions of a prosecutor to investigate and make sure that there's not a political agenda, there's not an overcharging problem, there's not corruption in our process. Because if we get rid of corruption through checks and balances, which is constitutional, right? If we apply that to the prosecutor, then all of a sudden the prosecutor knows that they can't get away with abusing their power, and things just kind of seem to invisibly correct themselves in a lot of ways. Number 1. Number 2, I want to do some things on Brady reform. And for those who don't know, that's about the disclosure of information between a prosecution and a defense. And without boring you to death about that, it's just one of my elements, okay? Number 3, education. And I think that's one thing David's talking about too that's very astute. Prosecutors need to know that the goal of a prosecution is not to win, it's to find justice. That means that if you are over prosecuting to get an advantage, to get a win, you're corrupting the process, and it's wrong. And like David said, we have these competitive juices inside. When I play basketball with my kids, I'm 57 years old. You know, I still want to win because I'm competitive. Prosecutors have got to tone it back and be educated, and even judges need, I think, more of this to understand what the true role of a public servant in the prosecution system and justice system is. And the fourth thing, I would talk about resources. So I want you to know that I have a prosecution plan that I think deals with the justice and accountability checks and balances side that I think would really help to correct some of the problems we have in our justice system. But I don't think I have all the answers. I think that if I were Attorney General, I would bring in the good county attorneys in our state. And I would say, let's get together and let's talk about these issues of corruption and jury trial issues that Mr. Leavitt has and other things, and say, how do we get this right for Utah residents? Because we are here, the government was formed to secure our liberties, not to control us and own us. And so that's all I want to say about that. Now I want to go back to the thing about Mr. Reyes. One thing that David didn't say, and I think he's just too kind.
I'm going to interrupt you
to get into this.
I'm going to interrupt you.
Okay.
I want to come back and talk about criminal justice after you talk about this.
You bet. You got it. That's fine. And that is this. This is a time to be direct. This is a time for you to understand what's happening. And so I'm going to ask you for license to say this. In 2014, Mr. Reyes took a $20,985 contribution in September of 2014 from Washakie Energy Resources. Now, if you know who Washakie Energy Resources is, they're owned primarily by the Kingston polygamous clan that U.S. Attorney John Huber, the U.S. Attorney for Utah, said a few weeks ago when one of their partners was convicted of a lot of felonies, said that he's known for 25 years that the Kingstons were a criminal enterprise family. In law enforcement, we know they're a criminal enterprise family, okay? So it's not a secret in the political justice system, or sorry, the criminal justice system, that the Kingstons are a problem. But he took $20,985. A few months later, on January 10th, I believe, he took $10,000 additional money from Sally Kingston. I do not know why she gave it to him herself. I don't care why, but that's also, she's an executive of Washakie Energy, all right? A few months later, Washakie was fined $3 million publicly for bogus fuel credits by the EPA. And a few months later, a big article was written about the questionable fundraising tactics of Sean Reyes and mentioned the Washakie donations. 6 months later, on December 31st of 2015, Sean Reyes took another $20,000 from this company that had been fined federally for bogus fuel credits. In other words, fraud. He took $20,000 more. He put it into an account with $250,000. I've researched this. It was his campaign account. At the end of the year, he had $257,000 in that account. If I'm getting boring, let me know, okay? But here's the truth. 6 weeks later, Washakie was raided by federal investigators, and it was very public. And Sean Reyes was sitting there with $250,000 in commingled funds, the $50,000 or whatever was left after just 6 weeks before, in his commingled account of $250,000. So he's asked by the press, what are you going to do with the $50,985? And his campaign finance chairman said, we're going to escrow the money because we don't know what's going on. 2 years later, this family was charged with the federal crimes. He was asked again, what have you done with the money? And they said, that's a stupid question. Of course it's escrowed, it's put away, it's locked down. And that was in August of 2018. Then the family pled guilty to a $512 million federal tax fraud. They'd never been prosecuted in Utah. The Attorney General hadn't prosecuted them in Utah while they're under this big investigation federally for this big tax scheme, right? What are the chances they haven't violated state laws and communications fraud laws and things like that? But nothing, right? So 6 months after they plead guilty, there's a little press release that comes out. It's called a donation clarification. It's dated November 25th, 2019. I want you to know the truth here, all right? And it says the following, and this is what I want you to understand. It says, in 2014, the campaign received support from Washakie Energy Resources. In 2014, it doesn't mention 2015. And then it says, by the time we were talked to by federal agents in 2016, the money had already been spent. Therefore, it couldn't be escrowed. Now you think about what I just said. The truth is that Reyes received $20,985 in 2014, but he also received $10,000 in January of 2015 and $20,000 on the last day of 2015, just 6 weeks before the raid on that office when he promised to escrow. And he put that money into a $250,000 escrow account. So what was he trying to say to you in that press release by not acknowledging that he had $30,000 in 15 and trying to make it look like there was a 2-year gap between the time he received the money and the time the officers were raided? And I want you to ponder that question as you consider that he is the chief law enforcement officer of our state and has a duty to be honest with you. And so when I was quoted in the Tribune as saying, maybe it's a lie, that's the basis for that statement. So, and the shocking thing is what David talked about, that he raised $385,000 this year, put it into his campaign account since January 1st. He spent $60,000 on a lavish hotel during the Sundance Film Festival for who knows what kind of parties. Spent another $52,000 a few weeks later at the same area in Deer Valley, okay? But he doesn't have I'm not going to call it integrity, I can't think of a better word for it, to reimburse $50,000 he received in criminal crime proceeds that I think he misled us about. And that's an issue for you as voters. Because if your attorney general does not have integrity, then why would you have him be your attorney general and serve another 4 years when these types of activities are going forward? And every 4 years, you have a chance to hear the truth about what your elected officials are doing. And so this is interview time. All right, David, I think I've said enough, but I just wanted you to know that that's important and material to this election and to who you think we are. And I say to you, look at me, dig as deep as you want, and you will find that I had an impeccable record until these lies were made about me. And I've defended myself in every process with every honor I could, because it means something to me to have honor. And that's why I stood up and defended myself. And that's why I felt like I could run again. And David, I have no reason to question your honor. And I think that's a very important qualification for an attorney general. Don't you agree?
I do. And let me say this. I'd like to get back to my plan, if that's okay, to talk about this, because it is, I trust you as the delegates, frankly, to be able to look through, to look at the fine print, to look and, it's just like you're like a jury, frankly. I always found whenever I tried a case, either prosecuting or defending, that what I thought would win the case, it's always something different that the jury picks up on. That's something that I've never thought of before. And as you examine really what we're talking about, I think that you'll be able to see you're smart enough to be able to read between the lines. And so I'd like to get back, if I can, and I'd like to talk about criminal justice. I'd like to give you, I have a policy, not a plan, but a policy in my office for how we deal with these very, very difficult questions. And I'm going to differ a little bit from John, because when you sit in the chair of the elected prosecutor, and I agree that we need to get away from retribution and just the purpose behind the criminal justice system is to just kick people as hard as we can. That doesn't help society. It doesn't help the humanity that's within us. It doesn't help them overcome what their issues are. But the term that says our role is to find justice is such an elusive thing, not only to define, and it's even more difficult to figure out what that means. Let me give you an example from some real life cases that I deal with. You know, I have 5,000 cases in my office. I have 50 deputies who work for me, and you know, they all have their perspective on what, you know, should occur. I have my perspective on what should occur, and I say to them, I say, listen, I trust your heart. I trust my heart. But at the end of the day, the authority that I have, I received from the people of Utah County, and the authority that you have, you received from me. And so your obligation is to answer to me. I'm your only client. And my obligation is to answer to the people of Utah. And so we deal with cases where let's say that someone commits a crime. Let's say that it's a you know, something that's not violent, but it's a felony. All right. And there's a victim that's been harmed. They've lost several $1,000s. And we charge the person with the crime. That person has a spouse, that person has children, he has a job. And we say, okay, well, our main goal is to make the victim whole. Well, our main goal is to make the victim whole, but we have to recognize that every time we open up the lid to people's lives in a criminal case, we create other victims. Well, we don't create the victims, but other victims are created because of the conduct that has occurred. You have children who suddenly don't have a parent because they're incarcerated. You have a spouse who now may lose their house because there's lack of income. And so there are victims all over the place. And you know, we used to have we used to call bastard children in the olden days when a child didn't have a parent. And the reality is, that child did nothing wrong. And that child should have every advantage as any other child. We all know that now. Well, we have bastard victims. We have children and spouses and employers who are affected tremendously by what occurs into a criminal case. And so when you deal with a criminal case, you have to look at what's going to protect community. What is it that protects us? And that's where you get into the weeds, and you have to understand that every criminal case is an individual case. And it's like building a brick building. You know, it may be 10 stories tall, but you still have to handle every individual brick. You have to put the mortar on it, you have to slap it down, and you have to do everything you can so that every brick is straight, because if you don't, your building won't be good. And the problem here is how do you do that with all the moving parts that are going around? How do you do that with, you know, victims that want this and victims that want that, and you've got, you know, 100 other cases that you're dealing with, and the only way that you can deal with that is to return to basic principles of constitutionality, and you realize, okay, our criminal justice system is flinging around in every possible direction, and my obligation as the elected prosecutor is to return, you know, to being able to look at every case and to be able to return to true principles. And to do that, you know, you got to engage in a few things. You know, number one, you have to realize that sometimes you protect society more by not making someone a criminal. And so I've created a pre-filing diversion program. It's the first of its kind in the state. It says, you know what, if you'll get help beforehand, if you'll pay your debt to society, if you'll go make the victim whole, and you're a low-risk offender, and you can learn your lesson, and you can do it the next 4 to 6 weeks, we won't charge you with the crime because we think that you're better off learning your lesson and not being a criminal. You know, that makes victims whole more quickly. That makes people learn their lesson more quickly, and it declutters the criminal justice system. There is a way for us to return to constitutional principles, but we will never do it unless we engage in the real reform of the criminal justice system. And it's not changing the laws. It's not changing the procedures. It's expanding our hearts as prosecutors. It's being able to recognize the humanity that exists in all of us. And you know, last night I had a great event. I had Bernie Carrick, who's the former New York Police Commissioner, spent 30 years as a New York Commissioner, and then was targeted for tax fraud. He went to federal prison, spent 3 years in prison, and well, he'll point out 3 years and 11 days, which illustrates what that feels like. You know, how much worse it is every day. Pat Nolan, who is a former California legislator who was also targeted and spent time in prison, both of them pardoned by President Trump. It's a fascinating discussion, but he talks about it. He talks about a person that entered his prison camp when he was a prisoner, that went in just a completely just out of central casting, a Marine. His clothes were starched, his boots were polished. He was yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, and that's the way he went in. When he came out of prison, he was a thug. He had his pants down to his bottom. He had prison tattoos all over his body. He was popping off and loudmouth to everybody. And we have to realize that we have to come up with solutions that are different than just putting people in prison. Not jailing nonviolent, finding a different solution for a nonviolent offender is among the most pressing issue we have. Now, the easy case is the case that where someone is dangerous and you put them in prison. We know that has to happen. I do that on a daily basis. But we've got to get down to understanding that included in these constitutional principles that we're talking about is the need to recognize the humanity of every victim, the humanity of every defendant, the humanity of every family member of every defendant, because that's truly the only way that we're going to fix our system. And it starts with the perspective and the heart of the prosecutor. All right, John, let's move on, shall we?
Thanks, David.
This is a very short question. I'm gonna take one sentence, and I'm gonna ask you to take one sentence so that we can move on. Mr. Leavitt, why should John Swallow be the Attorney General? Mr. Swallow, why should David Leavitt be the Attorney General? I'm going to say John Swallow would be a good Attorney General because he understands the need to reform our criminal justice system, and he's resolute enough to do it. Go ahead, one sentence.
Yeah, I was asked a question like that when I was running for Congress. Say something nice about your opponent. I can't say enough nice things about Mr. Leavitt, and I think he'd be honest, and I think he loves people, and I think he understands that government is about people, and he wants to reform the system and make change. And that's one of the problems we have right now is I haven't seen any change in 6 years, any significant change in 6 years. Even the one issue that Mr. Reyes is holding out as his big issue, the laws haven't changed in that area since when I was in the Attorney General's office. And that's not to say that maybe they need to change, but it just goes to show that when you're really in there 6 years, if it's an important issue to you, you should be able to move that issue aggressively, both with respect to changes in the law and then enforcement of the law as well. But yeah, I think David would be a fair-minded, caring, and he'd want to have vision to change things. And I think that's great. That's what we need.
Thank you. Next question, 2 quick questions. One, you both have spoken about reforming the Attorney General's office. How long would it take to enact the changes you're proposing? And number 2, what role does the federal government, does the Attorney General play in recovering Utah lands from the federal government? Yeah, because we've already answered that question, let's only answer number one. And John, you go ahead and I'll follow up with you.
So I was so focused on the second question.
First
What
question,
changes need to be made and how long would it take?
no, simply how long would it take to enact the changes you're proposing?
I would start from day one. First day in office, I'm going to start to interview, because I'll have some lead time, interview people that could run the investigations on government abuse of their power in agencies. I don't know if I talked about that earlier, but one of my platforms is that agencies can abuse their power, and we're going to make sure we bring checks and balances to all areas of the Attorney General's office, to state agencies that are abusing their power. So in the first couple of weeks, I'd want to hire the right people to start to investigate complaints of abuse of government power by state agencies against the individual citizens and businesses. And then as far as prosecution reform, I want to start right away to meet with people. And my policy is always cut once, but measure twice before you start cutting. So I'm not going to be so excited about getting changes made in the first week on something as significant as prosecution reform, as I'm going to be starting to get a group together in the office of the Attorney General and putting together the right minds to fix and start on my plan, augment my plan, and move things forward. And I expect within the first 6 months of my administration, there's going to be a entirely new look and feel. We're going to put new oxygen in the rooms. We're going to have new leadership in the office. We're going to bring people who are public servants, who are bright and astute, who care, who will work with the governor and the legislature and the people of Utah and serve them as our government is supposed to serve us, because it's not about government. Government is for us, people, and it's for you as citizens. And so we're going to bring a lot of new ideas and oxygen, and we're going to get started. And I think within 6 months, you're going to love the changes that you see if I'm the Attorney General. And I started it when I was the new Attorney General, and then it got so distracting but a lot of the things I started are Mr. Reyes is taking credit for. And I think that's great, because if you have vision and ideas, other people can develop those ideas. Like the Safe UT app he talks about in his campaign video. Guess whose vision that was? That was my vision. And I got Senator Thatcher involved in that vision. And now I'm proud that the Attorney General is talking about what a great thing that is, because ideas, vision, leadership, that's the role of the Attorney General. Most of the prosecutions happen at the county level. And so there's some that happen at the AG level, but it's about leadership and vision and resources and being able to work with people and caring about people and changing the attitude and the perspective. So it's about defending our liberties and our rights and serving the people. And that's what the role of an Attorney General, in my view, is. It's a little different from county attorney. And I think David understands that.
Yeah, I do. And I'm going to say this. You know, when I ran for Utah County Attorney, I ran unapologetically to reform the criminal justice system. And it wasn't anything against anyone in my office, and it wasn't against anyone in law enforcement. It wasn't against any of the public defenders. But what I've found in the last 15 months is that there's not a system anywhere that wakes up in the morning and says, you know, thank you so much for trying to change me. And you know, people resist change. And when you say, how long will it take to enact the changes you're proposing? Well, it depends on, you know, I mean, there are so many areas in which we need change. We need statutory change where we work with and tweak laws that deal with incarceration, that deal with different penalties and different issues. And so on day one, actually prior to day one, if I get the nomination, I'll start working with legislators at specific areas of the law that need to be changed. There's also problems in, you know, that we have a huge problem in the state of Utah that in sexual assault and other kinds of violent crime, that they get reported. You know, for example, if a person's been sexually assaulted and they go to the police and they do a rape, have a forensic exam, and they say to the police, "I want this prosecuted." You know, it's a shocking statistic. I had someone in my office who analyzed every case in Salt Lake County and every case in Utah County from 2010 to 2018. That case, an allegation, a forensic exam, an expressed desire to have it prosecuted, only 23% of the time that case makes it to the county attorney's office. 77% of the time that stays at the police office. Now, and so you have huge issues of reform in dealing with changing the mindset of law enforcement. These are good people, but they have a different perspective. And so, you know, that's the kind of change that quite frankly takes a long time. Then you have, you know, issues of changing plea bargaining policy and charging policy. And you have the fact that you're working with very independent county attorneys who have for a long time operated 100% completely independently and separately from the county attorneys or from the attorney general and from each other, frankly. And so, you know, that's about relationships. That's about, you know, you don't rule by edict. You sit down and you create a relationship with people where they're able to see it. And those sorts of things take a long time. Then you have, you know, huge issues in the public defense arena that you have to shift, that you have to reform. Because quite frankly, our freedoms are like the flag in a tug of war. You know, and on one side is the prosecution, and on the other side is the defense. And the flag is our freedom, and the only way that flag stays out of the mud is if you have equal tension fighting back and forth in our system. And it's disproportionate right now, and we need to look at that because our freedoms are so important. So to answer the question, how long will it take to enact the changes I'm proposing? I'm going to spend the rest of my professional life trying to reform the criminal justice system. Some things will be done more quickly than others. Some things will take longer. But I will say to you that every American has a solemn duty to do what they can to build and protect their country. You don't have to hold public office to do it. You can. I mean, we have to do whatever's in our power to save our country. And it's taken us, you know, since the Civil War times to get our criminal justice system to the muck and the mire in which it sits now. It's going to take us a long time to reform it truly. You know, I keep talking about the evils of plea bargains. None of us, we will never eliminate plea bargains in any of our lifetimes, but we can reverse them. We can take them from 99% down to 90% and continue to, but my sacrifice to America, my bequest to my children and to your children is that in whatever position I'm serving, whether it's a county attorney, whether it's attorney general, whether it's a private citizen, I will spend the rest of my professional life trying to reform the criminal justice system. Great.
Now, can we ask a question that deals with some of the other pressing issues like COVID-19 or other
you have access to the question and answer screen there?
What's that? I can't see it. So
at the bottom of your screen, there's 47 questions.
I know. And I think that it would be fair to say that there's probably one on COVID-19 if there's that many questions.
Let me scroll down here. If you see that I'm scrolling past your question, it's John's fault, not mine. Hold it against him. Let's see.
And if there's 47 questions and not one on COVID-19, then I've missed something.
There are 47 questions on this line and not a single one on COVID-19. And there are 99 new messages on the chat line. I'm going to say this. Hey, John, why don't you tell us about COVID-19?
Thank you.
I have a question.
Well, every once in a while, I think there's a misconception sometimes by people about what the Attorney General really does. they say that, you know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I've tried to spend my career in being a student of what the roles are of different things that I'm involved in my life, as a husband or father, as a student, as a lawyer, civil lawyer, partner, attorney general. And so one of the things that the attorney general is the person who really stands between you and the flexing of government power, or the over exercise of government power. And we've seen front and center a collision between something real, which is our health concerns, and an impact on our individual liberties and rights. And so as important as prosecution reform is, or prosecution is, for the attorney general and for the county's current county attorneys, there are other roles that are important. I want to make sure that those roles get equal time and coverage, because you need to understand that that liberty role is important. I've been very concerned, frankly, at the response that we've had nationally, and even in some areas in the state of Utah, with respect to the health concerns we have and the role of the government in protecting us on that by force or by order. I'm very pleased that the governor has not ordered us to stay home, but has directed us to stay safe and stay home and use our common sense and be smart, right? Because Americans, and Utahns particularly, the smartest state in the country, we are smart enough to make important adult decisions and to deal with the consequences of our choices. That's a Republican principle. It's when we think that as people in government that we know all the answers and we can force people to do things, that we get into the oppressive side and the violation of our liberties. And what's happened here is that some of the counties have gone beyond what the state felt was wise and essential by shutting down businesses that they determine arbitrarily, in my view, are a non-essential business. And the consequence of that is tremendously devastating on the confidence of the future of people who will get into small business, which is the backbone of our economy and the protection we have against a government-run economy or socialism. And if you don't think that that's creeping along, then you're not paying attention the way I'm paying attention, because I'm really concerned about it. So my concern as Attorney General, and I'm going to bring a constitutional officer into the office that's going to work and advise not only on prospective legislation, but we're going to also look at what's in the books, because here's the example. The current solution on 3009, and it may be changed before tomorrow when they vote on it, because I haven't seen the latest editions of that, is let's just take the power that the legislature is given to the counties and we'll just bring it back to the state, because the state is sovereign. And I talk about that in my plan on COVID-19. You'll see I'm a very plan-oriented guy. I've got it on my website, right? But as I thought through it, I talked to delegates who are very, very wise and experienced, and I listen to delegates. I listen to people. I don't have all the answers. The guy said, look at line 107. Why are we giving the government power over our person and property during a health emergency when we haven't done anything wrong? That seems like a violation of our constitutional liberties for our property. And then I went to the Constitution. I looked at the Amendment 5 and Article 1, Section 22, which deals with taking of property without for public use without just compensation. And it seems to me that when you shut down a business and deprive the owner of that property right of being in business, right, that there should be a remedy. And I call it a taking, kind of like eminent domain, a remedy. And to me, that solves a real problem that I was experiencing when I thought, how are we ever going to restore the confidence of a small business owner to go back into small business after we've shut them down arbitrarily, and not think that the next wave that comes along, the same thing's going to happen again, and the same thing's going to happen again. And pretty soon, why are they in business? Because they're not in business for charitable reason. They're in business to make money and build our economy and create jobs and retire someday, right? And so when I talk about COVID-19, I want you to know that this is the perfect example for us to make sure that we have an attorney general in office who understands these constitutional principles, and will have the courage to research and make sure we're advising and standing up and enforcing the laws, or standing against the laws and challenging the laws if we need to make sure that there is not an unconstitutional power being exercised by the government against the individual liberties of an individual or a business owner. And I wanted to say that about COVID-19. And I want to make sure I share with you my belief that we need to stay safe, but we should stay free as well. And that's something I'll work on as Attorney General. David?
Thank you, John. You know, I'm one of the I guess statistically speaking, I'm one of the first known, wasn't one. I've had COVID-19, and I had it shortly after I announced my candidacy for Attorney General, and it was horrible. I mean, I'm still overcoming it now. I'm still not 100%. I spent almost 2.5 weeks not being able to get out of bed. Unfortunately, I wasn't required to be hospitalized, but it's bad stuff. And I will say that in my belief, I don't think government really has the ability to protect us from that. Benjamin Franklin said that a person who will sacrifice a little liberty in exchange for a little security will soon find that he has neither. And I believe that it's very smart to say, let's social distance. I think it's very smart for us to take responsibility in that process of social distancing. But I don't believe that it's the government's role to say, we're going to close this business, but we're going to leave these businesses open. I mean, I just think that basically infringes upon our basic liberties. Now, I have a unique role in this, because if the governor were to order a statewide order, or if the Utah County Health Department were to give an order that was a stay-at-home order, at the end of the day, and again, this is the power of the prosecutor, at the end of the day, that flows to me as the elected county attorney to decide what to do with that. And I've been very frank and very open and very forthright in saying, I'm not going to prosecute people who violate those orders. My duty is not to the governor. My duty is not to the county commissioner or the county health department. My duty is to the Constitution, primarily, of the United States of America, and to the state of Utah. And I have independent authority. I'll have to answer to the people of Utah County for that. But that's an answer that I'm willing to look straight in the eye and say, you know what, I believe that we all have a responsibility to protect ourselves. I think we all have a responsibility to act socially responsible. But it's not something that, as the Utah County attorney, I am going to choose to enforce. I just won't.
Great. Now, David, we probably ought to think about winding things down at some point, because we have lost some people, and so we can take another question if you want, or we can wind up. What's up?
I think that you're right. I think that we have to wind up. I mean, the truth is there are 60 more questions on one and 99 other messages on another. And I have to say, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have had this discussion. John and I feel very similar on a lot of things, and I'm sure differently on others, but this has been a good night. I wish that Sean Reyes would have been with us, but he wasn't. So yeah, why don't you, I think I started in the first, so why don't you start now, and then I'll end it, if that's okay.
That's great. Thanks, David. I want to also echo what David has said. These are interesting times. I think we've been prepared all of our lives, probably since the Declaration of Independence, for these times. We have the benefit of history to show us what can happen if we cross the lines of liberty that are drawn so well by our Constitution. I do not see the Constitution as an advisory document. I see it as an inspired document that was created with an amazing situation in Philadelphia through the leadership of great patriots, representatives who loved freedom and had experienced tyranny, and in a magical, miraculous way, were able to come up with not an advisory document, but a fundamental platform for freedom. We cannot ignore that document today of all times. And so I see it as a firm document, not a living instrument. As Attorney General, my vow to you is that I will honor it and I will lead the office of Attorney General with fidelity and strength and vision, that I will bring people in. I will work collaboratively with people, smart people, concerned people, citizens, and elected officials to make the office what it really can become, servants under the law for the people of Utah, to make sure that agencies are respectful and appreciative of the people who pay their salaries and give them the power that's given to them by the people, that we are applying checks and balances, true accountability to all systems in our government, and that we are operating with absolute integrity. That is my platform. That is my belief. I am so appreciative of this American system that let me be falsely accused, clear my name, and come back and finish something I started that I still feel passionate for, but I feel ever more prepared to do because of my experiences that I'm bringing with me. May God bless each of you and your families. I want to say this. I admire David Leavitt, and I would say this. I hope for your first place vote. And I would encourage you to decide to make a change in our Attorney General, because I do believe, for a lot of reasons, it's time for a change. I think our best contributions are usually in the first 4 years, sometimes in 2 terms. It's like eating multiple cheeseburgers. The first one's great, the second one's not quite so great, and the third one, by then you're getting sick. And I just think it's the same way in politics. We ought to discipline ourselves not to feel like we have to have career politicians in one office. May God bless you and your families, and may we always stay safe and stay free. And I would appreciate your support. And did I say that David, if I were choosing, David would get my second place vote?
Thank you. Thank you, John. You know, I'll never forget going with my wife and our then 6 children to Ukraine and landing on the 1st of November of 2004. And when we got around the city, there was an election going for president, and everywhere we went, we saw these huge government banners for the government candidate, and nothing of a formal nature for the opposition candidate. Now, the opposition candidate was a man named Viktor Yushchenko. But everywhere we went, we saw little vestiges of orange. There'd be a piece of orange on a lapel, an orange headband, an orange banner on a car, a piece of orange construction paper in a car window, in an apartment window. Everywhere we went, we saw this orange. And I asked a colleague there with whom I was working, what is the orange? And he says, well, it's the color of our opposition. And I said, what do you mean the color of our opposition? And he said, well, we are having this election. I said, yeah, I know. And he said, everyone wants the opposition candidate to win, but everyone also understands that the government will rig the election and will hold it and keep itself into power. And that was so far outside my experience, I didn't really know how to relate to it. And I said, well, who do you support? He said, well, I support the opposition. And he said, well, I said, where's your orange? He said, well, I told you that the government's going to declare itself the winner. I'm not stupid. I'm not going to brand myself like that. And I said, well, that's really interesting. I said, tell me about this opposition candidate. Well, the opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, had been the head of the central bank. He had then been the prime minister. He'd done great things, but he could tell that the communist regime in Ukraine was not bringing them freedom, and so they parted ways. And he became the opposition candidate for president. And when the people started to really rally around Viktor Yushchenko and the government got worried, the government poisoned him. They poisoned him with dioxin, and they put the thumb screws on his best friend. The best friend delivered them to a dinner. They poisoned his food, and suddenly he fell violently ill. I mean, he's told me the story personally. It's an incredible story, and almost almost overnight, Viktor Yushchenko went from looking like Cary Grant, a Ukrainian version of Cary Grant, to looking like this, a man who was literally nearly dead. And yet he continued on. And the election came, and the government said, you know, this has been a tremendous election, freedom and fairness. That's really been the victor here. But the government has, in fact, eked out a very close election. So now everyone go back to work, and we'll see in 5 years when we have another election. Well, Viktor Yushchenko, he didn't stand for that. He went down to the square in Kiev, and I was there. I witnessed this. It was unbelievable to see. And he said, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we have had our independence from the Soviet Union for 13 years, but we've never had our freedom. And unless they take me out of here in a box, I will never leave here until they recognize me as the president and we can establish freedom in Ukraine. He gave the speech. They took him off the stage. They pumped him full of morphine and took him home, took him to a little tent they had there in the square. And an amazing thing happened. Within about 2 or 3 days, there were 50, 60,000 people in this square that you see depicted behind me. And then it became even more amazing. Within 10 days, there were 500,000 people in the square. You'll see right behind me a much younger version of me. As I stood there, my office was just, you know, outside the screen about 50 yards. As I saw this, this is freedom in the making. This is unbelievable. And my wife and 6 children and I, we just sat there taking in the greatest history lesson about American freedom than we could possibly, and it was in Ukraine. Well, the government at that point freaked out. They knew that they had problems. And so they started fabricating newscasts. They cut off all the traffic of every kind to the city, and the crowd started to dwindle. The temperature started getting lower, the snow started getting deeper, and it was heartbreaking to see what these people were going through. And it looked to me like it might fail. Somewhere in the back of that crowd, there was a 48-year-old sign language translator named Natalia Dmytryk. And Natalia Dmytryk would protest by day, and by night, she would go and translate on the sign language screen. And she would say, you know, we should translate the fabricated newscast. After like 3 days of this, she said to herself, you know, I just felt dirty. I couldn't do it anymore. I knew I had to do something. And so she went in to the newscast with an orange ribbon tied around her wrist, but hidden in her sleeve. And when she went to sign the language, you know, sign the newscast, the orange ribbon dropped down, and she said to this, I'm speaking to the deaf of Ukraine. I'm sorry that I have been interpreting lies. Our country is in revolution. Viktor Yushchenko is our president. I need you as the deaf of Ukraine to tell everyone in your circle to get to the capital, because we are in revolution and we need you here now. And then she said, I don't know if you'll ever see me again. Well, word got out through the deaf of Ukraine, this most insignificant demographic group in Ukraine. And within, you know, just about 10 days, they came by horses, they came by carts, they came on foot, they came everywhere they could. A colleague of mine held 44 Ukrainian peasants in her downtown Kiev apartment that was 400 square feet, and she hadn't known, she'd never met any one of them. The country closed, around each other and began to regulate themselves in a way that was like a beehive of commonality. And the crowd increased from how it had dwindled until about 10 days. There were over 1.5 million people in that square. And they stayed there. They took over every building on the square. It was peaceful. They forbade alcohol so that there wouldn't be drunken brawls. They completely regulated themselves. They stayed there for 6 weeks. And after 6 weeks, the government relented and made Viktor Yushchenko the president of Ukraine. And in one of the greatest acts of poetic justice that I've ever known, who was it that interpreted the sign language for the presidential inauguration? It was none other than Natalia Dmytryk. Well, why do I raise this to you tonight? I raise this to you tonight because we are in a critical moment in our country. This goes so far beyond this race. We have a criminal justice system that is in absolute shambles for ways that it will take years for us to fix if we start now. But we have to have the courage to start now. We have to have the courage of what I saw in Ukraine, frankly. We have to have the courage to stand up. We have to have the courage to be like Natalia Dmytryk and say, I may be an insignificant sign language translator on the screen, but I have a voice. Pennsylvania founder John Dickinson implored us, it is the duty of every man and woman to maintain to the utmost the constitutional right of a jury trial, to restore it to its ancient dignity, if at all impaired, and above all to guard it with the most jealous circumspection. I gave you the John Adams quote already. The heart and lungs of liberty, jury trial and representative government. Without them, we have no other fortification against being ridden like horses, worked like cattle, and fed and clothed like swine and hounds. I'm making these changes in Utah County. I'm seeking the office of Attorney General so that I can make these changes across the state. I can't do it without you. I need your vote. I need your support. And yes, I know John Swallow wants your first place vote. I want your first place vote. I need your first place vote. And you're going to have to judge for yourselves who will be the best at implementing these changes. And this isn't, John can tell all the reasons why he's best when he's not with me, and I'll tell all the reasons why I'm best when I'm not with him. But this is a moment when the two of us come together and implore you to understand that this is the moment. The next 4 days, or 3 or 4 days, is the moment when you have the power of Natalia Dmytryk. You have the power to speak to the insignificant groups in Utah. We're all insignificant people at some level. I implore you to reach out to your fellow delegates. I implore you to email and call and raise awareness that we need a different attorney general. We need an attorney general who will actively seek to reform our criminal justice system. We need an attorney general who will protect our public lands. We need an attorney general who will represent and care for us, the citizens of the state of Utah. Together, we can do it. And again, yes, I unapologetically want to be your first place vote. I need it. If John's your first place vote, I need to be your second place vote, and vice versa. So we bid you farewell. We thank you for serving as a delegate. I believe that the convention process is a solemn and a somber process. And we're getting through that, and it won't be great when we're finished. But let's do it right. That's my plea to you. That's my expression of gratitude to you. I hope you have a great night. And May God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I echo what he said. David, do you want to give everybody your phone number in case they want to call you?
Yes, I'm going to put it right here on the chat line. I'll put it here to all panelists and attendees. My cell phone number is 801-574-3130. Call me if you have any questions or issues, including if you're having a tough time with the Votes app, call me. I'll be your advocate with the state party. Here's my email address, david@davidleavitt.com. Do you have the ability to type something in there, John? If you want to, you go ahead and type your.
I don't, but I'm going to just let you know what it is. Thanks, David. My cell number, which goes right to this phone here, is 801-949-9450. And my email, my personal email, it's not my campaign email, but it's my personal email. And I want you to hang on to that because when the campaign's over, I want you to still be able to get hold of me. It's John, Johne, Swallow @gmail.com. And my website is www.johnswallow.com, which has my plan on it. And again, I, like David, want to thank you for your time and David for that inspirational message. And we pray that God's blessings will be with you and your families, and that we appreciate your efforts to be here tonight, late on a night before the election starts, and do your diligence and make the difference, because of Senate Bill 54, some of the races won't be determined at the convention, but this one can be through the diligence and desires of the delegates like you. So thank you for taking that responsibility seriously, and may God bless you all.
Thank you.